Welcome to the Bay Area Book Festival. I'm Quinn Roberts.
And I'm Tej Wong.
And we are both so honored to be moderating this panel with these two magnificent authors. First, we would each like to say a few words about our distinguished authors.
Jan Terlouw is a retired Dutch politician and diplomat who has written 24 children's books, most notably Winter in Wartime and How to Become King, both of which were acclaimed motion pictures. Jan has received numerous writing awards over the past 48 years. Welcome, Jan, and we're pleased to have you.
Thank you.
Lois Lowry is an American author of several books for children and young adults, including The Giver Quartet and Number the Stars, both of which are Newbery Medal winners. The Giver is one of my personal favorites, as Tej and I both read it in our English class just last year. She is very well known for writing complex themes for young audiences, all of which are extremely riveting.
So how are you each doing in these times?
How are we doing? So far, so good.
But yeah, how are you doing?
Okay, it's Corona time, huh? In the Netherlands, it's getting better now. In the US, not so much, as I understand. But I give always, all the time, lots of speeches and lectures, and that has gone down now. Now I'm speaking to 20 people, 1.5 meters apart in a room.
Yes.
But it's restarting a little bit.
And I will just add that I am taking care of my husband, who has been hospitalized for 2.5 months and lost 30 pounds from this virus. So I'm feeding him a lot, and he has his sense of taste back, and he's beginning to eat again, and he's gained a little weight. So this is affecting all of us, and it's a very difficult time.
Yeah.
So that was quite serious with your husband.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that he's doing better. I'm really glad. Sheltering in place for the past few months has really opened my eyes to the world around me in a very different way. I was wondering if you two are writing your books now under these select circumstances, would anything in the process of writing differ? And how is the situation affecting other writings that you may or may not be doing at this time?
Who do you want to answer first?
It doesn't matter.
And Jan, were you able to understand his question?
Yeah, more or less.
Why don't you try answering it?
You see, I have to clarify. I don't write very much for young people now. Anyhow, I am a politician and a scientist, and in general, I do other work. And writing has always been something in the sideline at Christmas time, in vacation times, and so on. So this Corona doesn't influence it that much, because I have so many other things to do. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I will just say that I have been in quarantine and very isolated for the past, whatever it's been, since the beginning of March. I had to make a speech in England on March 4th, and that's the last bit of travel that I did. I came home from that and have been quarantined and isolated since then. My husband went to the hospital on April 4th. So I'm a kind of solitary person anyway. And unlike Jan, writing is what I do all the time. It's always been how I've made my living. And so that hasn't changed much. There's no place I'd rather be than all alone in a room with a computer and words in my head. I think probably, though, it's changed the kind of writing I've been doing. And one book in particular, which I wrote probably 10 years ago, dealt with the 1918 flu epidemic. And so the publisher of that book, Scholastic Publishing, decided to republish it with a new cover On the new cover, the young protagonist, a girl, is wearing a mask. She wasn't wearing that on the old cover. And they had me write a new introduction to it. So I went back and reread that book, which seemed so timely now. There were so many similarities between 1918 and 2020. But aside from those things, I don't think much has changed in terms of writing. I'm curious, when Jan says he's a politician and a scientist, surely your activities in those realms have changed over the past 2 months. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, as a politician, I'm retired. I am 88 years old. So I have no regular job, but I'm still very interested in politics. I have lots of political contacts, and they have their difficulties, and I think a little bit with them.
Yeah.
As a scientist, I don't work anymore, of course. That's a long time ago. I was a nuclear scientist, and I did nuclear science for the first 13 years of my career, and then I changed to politics. And since I always told my children stories, I have 4 children, and my wife was always listening. Every evening a different story, every evening for 10 years. And my wife was saying more and more, Jan, write it down. I said, no, I'm a scientist. I write essays about physics. Write it down. Another nice story goes out of the window. And finally, I listened to my wife, and I can advise all men, in the end, listen to your wife.
Listen to the wife.
Because it happened to be successful. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is a question for Young. This novel ends at the end of the war when everything returns to almost normal. Why did you decide to end the story when you did? And did you ever consider a sequel when you published the book?
To change the end? Is that what you ask? To change the ending of the book?
I'm asking if you ever considered writing a sequel to the end of the book, because the end of the book, everything returns to almost normal, but it has this sort of effect on the reader that everybody's wondering what really happened to the characters.
Yeah, well, I think that book, Winter in Wartime, is not the kind of book that you have to continue writing a second or a third part. Of course, you are absolutely right. Things have changed. They have changed enormously. You young people, you have completely different problems than what we had at the time. We then had to rebuild the world. You have different problems. You have climate change, which is very serious. It's going to influence your future very much. So I lived in a completely different time, and I have written about them, but in other books.
Can I just add something to his, even though it was his question?
Yeah, go for it.
I very often get letters from kids who would like me to write a sequel to the book Number the Stars. And like Jan's book, that's a book that's set in Europe during World War II. Number the Stars is set in Denmark. And the book ends when the war ends. And so a sequel doesn't seem appropriate. The story has ended. I was telling the story of a child who helped her family save a Jewish friend. And that story was complete. And so a sequel, I told them, would be boring. Life isn't boring, as we know, but that particular book doesn't lend itself to a sequel.
Yeah, there are particular books that, like, it could use a sequel, and some that are just the end. So this question is for Lois. So I know this book is obviously true. It's about World War II, and World War II happened, obviously. But were the specific people that you mentioned in the book, were those real people, and did that actually happen to them, or was that was it more like realistic fiction?
Okay, on the horizon, Tej is holding it up, and I'll hold it up. this book, I was a child, like Jan, we're both very old, in our 80s, and I was also a child during that period of time. But it was when I was an adult and looked back at the old home movies that my father had taken, I discovered that a sequence showing me on the beach. I was born in Hawaii, in Honolulu, and there I am, a small child on the beach, in the movies that my father took, but I discovered as an adult that in the background, on the horizon, was a ship that a friend identified for me. A friend who was a naval officer said, "That's the Arizona." Now, kids don't recognize the name of that ship, but people my age remember the Arizona was a battleship that was sunk at Pearl Harbor. So your question has to do with whether the people in the book are real. When I began to be haunted by the fact that I had stood as a child on a beach looking at a ship that carried 1,200 young men, most of whom would be dead soon, I didn't quite know what to do with that information, but it haunted me for a while. And eventually I began to do research to find out who were those young men. And so I've included in the book stories. It's written in poetry because it came to me in the form of individual images, but I've written about some of those young men. There were 37 pairs of brothers on that ship. There was one pair of identical twins. And each of those people, each of those 1,100 and some young men had a story. And I couldn't tell them all in one book, particularly because I went on in the book then to deal with individuals in Hiroshima 4 years later. But the people in the book are real, and one of them stands out. I'm sorry to go on so long, but a little boy named Koichi Sei, who was 8 years old when the war ended, and I was 8 years old when the war ended, but he was Japanese, and he saw the atomic bomb destroy Hiroshima. He lived 50 miles away. He and I, later, when we were 11 years old, crossed paths because I lived then in Tokyo. And we looked at each other across a playground. We didn't meet until we were in our 60s. And we began to talk about our backgrounds and how they coincided. And he said to me, "Were you the girl on the green bicycle?" And that triggered this feeling in me that I hope is what the book is about. The fact that we are all connected to each other. That I was connected when I was 3 years old to the young men who would die on this ship. That I was connected and now are friends with and had lunch with just a few months ago, the young boy who had looked at me from a Japanese playground when we were children. And all of us are connected in these ways. I'm connected to Jan in ways, we don't have time to go into all of this, but I think it's important for children to realize how these things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen to actual people, and those people have a bond to each other. And now I'll be quiet so you guys can ask more questions.
This is actually a very similar question for Jan. All of the characters in this novel have separate and unique personalities, from Michelle's outgoing nature to Uncle Ben's aggressive temperament. How did you come up with these different personas? Did you draw from examples of life?
Yeah, most of these people really existed. Not exactly, but there was a traitor in my immediate environment. And there was somebody who was hiding Jews and was collaborating with the Germans in order to hide the Jews more safely. When I started to write Winter in Wartime, I thought, I don't want young people, when they have read it, to think, what a pity that I didn't experience this. What a wonderful time, what a heroism, what a solidarity, and so on. Wars are terrible. Wars are unjust. Wars kill people that have nothing to do with whatever. So I wanted to write a book in such a way that it should be the truth, but also that when you've read it, that you think, fortunately, it didn't happen to me. Now, you have read it, apparently. When you had read it, were you thinking, oh, what a wonderful, exciting time? Or you were thinking, unfortunately, it was not in my time?
I was thinking that, fortunately, it wasn't in my time.
Oh, good. Then I have succeeded in that. Because it's what Louis says, everywhere it happened. A boat full of 1,100 people in Pearl Harbor, all dead. Several boats. What happened in the concentration camps, it's unbelievable. It's unspeakable. It is unimaginable that human development could lead to something like that.
I just want to add something to what he's saying. My son was an Air Force pilot, and he was stationed in Germany and married a young German woman. And so my only granddaughter has grown up in Germany. And I go over there a couple times a year to visit my granddaughter, who now has just completed her education and is a teacher. But at any rate, because of her, I know that in Germany, the schools take very seriously their responsibility to teach German children about what happened in that country. And all German high school children, when they're in the gymnasium, what we call high school here, are taken to visit a concentration camp. I was at Dachau when I saw a group of German school children being taken through. And when they're outside, you know, they're kids, they're teenagers, they're fooling around, poking each other, and then they enter and they fall silent. They take it very seriously.
That's very
It
powerful.
was very, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, your turn.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to say that that's very powerful, and that is very good that they take it super seriously. It's important.
Well, I married a Jewish girl. She was a small child in the war, and she has lost a lot of her family, murdered in the camps. She's dead now, unfortunately, but she was a very lovely person. But she couldn't set a foot in Germany after the war for many years. She couldn't go there. Although she realized that the young Germans were really, it wasn't their fault, and they were good Democrats now, but it was difficult for her. I went to work in Sweden, and when you go from the Netherlands to Sweden, you have to go by car through Germany. And she said, please, you go with the stuff in the car, and I take the plane. And that has lasted about 25 years. And then our children grew up, and they said, Mom, look at them. They're people like we. It's not their fault. They're good Democrats now. And then finally, she has come to reconcile with the Germans a bit.
Can I tell a story that's connected to that? I'm sorry, we're not letting you ask you questions, but each thing he says reminds me of something.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead.
When my son, whom I mentioned, married a German woman, the wedding was in Germany. One of my best friends was in the United States, but she was Danish. And she had known my son since he was a little boy. And I invited her to come to Germany for the wedding. And she said, I cannot set foot in Germany like your wife. She said she was a child when Denmark was occupied by the Nazis. She said, I hate all Germans. I can't go to Germany. And so she didn't attend the wedding. After my son and his wife had been married 7 years and had a little girl who was 2 years old, my son was killed in a fighter plane. There's no end to warfare, of course, sadly. And he was buried in Germany. And my friend did not come to the funeral either. But when my granddaughter was about 4 years old, I took her to Denmark. I went to Denmark, and she and her mother flew up from Germany. We went to Tivoli, the wonderful park in the center of Copenhagen. And my friend Annalisa, my Danish friend, was living back in Denmark then, and I invited her to come to dinner. and to meet my little granddaughter. And she, who had said, I cannot meet any German, I hate all Germans, she did come. And I had told my little granddaughter, who was 4 years old, this friend of mine knew your papa. She knew him when he was a little boy. She can tell you funny stories about him. And so when Annalisa, my Danish friend, came, met us at the restaurant, she seemed a little hesitant, nervous about meeting Germans. But this little girl said to her, you knew my papa, tell me about my papa. And you could see that she changed, and she opened her arms and took this child into her arms. And I think this says something about what the future holds. It's children and what they learn and how they connect to each other that will eventually, one hopes, change the world.
Well, I'm so sorry.
Lois, did I understand that your son was killed?
Yes.
As a fighter?
Fighter pilot, F-15, yeah.
Your son?
My son, yes.
My God.
Yeah.
My God.
Well, may he rest in peace. I'm so sorry.
Thank you, Quinn. Do you have more questions?
Yes, we have more. Yeah. So what made you choose, or what inspired you to write powerful war reflection poems after being so widely renowned, like world renowned, for your dystopian novels such as The Giver?
Well, I've written many books, and they take different forms. I've written 48 books, and some are lighthearted, humorous books, and some are like The Giver, dystopian, and they take all sorts of different forms. And this one, as I said, it was triggered by my awareness of my connection to the young men on this ship. And I had never written a book in poetry form before, but these images of different people and their stories came to me that way. There was no plot. There was no beginning, middle, and end, but there were images. And so that's why a book almost tells you how to write it. That's hard to describe, but when I sat down to begin to write this one, that's the form that it took.
As you know, this book is about the Holocaust, which is a pretty heavy topic. When you were writing, was it hard to get through, or was there anything specific that was particularly difficult to write about?
My book is not about the Holocaust. My book is about it plays a small part in the book. Of course, I couldn't ignore it because it was a terrible thing that happened. But it's how I, as a child, lived through a war, and how difficult. I couldn't go to school, for instance, and I was with that war. There was people who were hungry and so forth. I have written it, and when I'd written it, to my surprise, it was well received. But there were also people who said it wasn't like that. And I thought that's true. There are so many kinds of wars. A war in a hungry city, a war in a concentration camp, a war on a battlefield, a war of a boy who can't go to school and is with that war in a village, and that was my war. But there are so many different wars. And so everyone has his own experience in such a war, and they all differ. They all differ. And I think this book of mine was quite successful because I've, as honestly as I could, written what I felt when my father was taken prisoner and had the danger to be shot as a hostage and so on. It's feelings. But other people had other experiences. And Lois tells different stories, and they're all true, and they're all worthwhile to
yes. And yet I've heard, and perhaps you have too, Jan, from people who say, why do we have to tell these stories again and again? Why don't we just forget all this? And it's so important that these stories be told. I got a letter, an email actually, quite recently, from a man who must be in his 80s. He didn't tell me how old he was. But I had written in this book about one of the young men who died on the Arizona, and he had left 2 children, 2 little boys named Jimmy and Gordon. And I got this email, and he said, "I'm Gordon. That was my father you wrote about." He wondered why I had chosen his father. And I didn't have an answer, really, because every young man on that ship had a story that could be told. I chose his father because I read an old newspaper interview with his mother, with the young sailor's mother, in which she said she had lost 2 sons previously. And she said in this interview, "I had bad luck with all my boys." And that just seems such a monumental thing to say, such a tragic thing to have to say, that's why I included that young sailor in the book. Mentioned his sons, and now I get a letter, and he says, "That was my father." And it brought home that connection.
That's incredible.
I just read a book by Dick Verhofstadt and Van Turnhout about a Jew, a Polish Jew, who came to Antwerp before the war. He was taken prisoner. He went to Dachau and to Auschwitz, and he came back, and he was not well received when he came back in Belgium. And in the end, most of it, what happened, I had read in other books, and I knew it. And still, to read it again, this terrible story, and to read in the end that they say, so many young people don't know about it. Yes. And they have to know about it, because it could happen again. If we don't defend the democratic right state we live in, then it can happen again. And you young people have to fight against it. You have to be warned that these things can happen. People have done it, and they can do it again. And only if you really know that it can happen, and that you fight all your life to prevent it. Therefore, it's important that we write about it and that you read it again and again.
And the people who can tell the stories from their own experience will be gone soon. So it's going to be there in the books to be read again and again.
Well, I have a question for Lois, and you pretty much already answered this question in your elaboration of my other questions. But what made you choose, or why did you choose poetry, specifically poetry, as your literary device to express a young child and such a young child's view of a horrific war and a horrific start to a war?
Well, and I tried to answer that, but there really is no answer. As I said, sometimes a book just tells you when you sit down and begin to write, it tells you how it wants to be written. And this was not a book with a hero and a protagonist and a plot. It was a book of little pieces of people's lives. And so I could have written it in prose, but it just fell into that poetic form that I chose to use, and it was challenging to write it that way, and probably makes it more challenging to read. But I think it was the way it wanted to be told.
Okay, this is also Jan. You may have already answered this in your other answers to your questions, but in the chapters of this book, Winter in Wartime, many things happen, like a secret letter, family betrayals, and many other things. Were any of the events that you wrote into these chapters based on events that you experienced?
Practically everything which is in the book really happened. But some of the things I experienced myself, and others I heard from the people immediately after the war that they had experienced it. For instance, this boy Dirk, who was captured and who was tortured and who jumped from the train and so forth, he was my neighbor. And he was 5 years older than I was, or 6. And he told me about it after the war. He still couldn't walk because he had broken his toes. And so many of the things really happened, but I, of course, as what a writer does, makes it a story and makes it a little bit different. But in essence, it all happened. for instance, myself once chased by the Germans when I rode with a car, with a horse before it, and they were trying to steal horses, or how they call it. I don't know the English word. Anyway, take horses away from farmers. And I was followed through the woods, and I ran fast, and they were behind me, but I escaped with that horse. That happened. This is something I remember.
I'm thinking of the word, because I know it from old cowboy movies. They rustle horses. Isn't that
They rustle.
what that's
that
called?
Must be it.
Horse rustling.
Yeah, rustling. That must be it. Thank you, Lois. Yeah.
Well, I have another question for Lois, and when did you kind of decide to use your own point of view to capture these events and kind of express them, or was it just the storytelling you how to tell it?
Well, like Jan, I was dealing with events that I had not participated in, but I had been aware of. I was born in Honolulu, and then I moved to Tokyo after the war ended. So I was in Tokyo when it was still, it had been badly bombed. And so I met people who had been there during the time of the war. So during the war itself, I was in a quiet little town in the United States, but my father, who was an Army officer, was off in the Pacific. As a child, I didn't understand what the war meant, really, because it wasn't happening around me. Unlike Jan, who was there in a place that was in the middle of it. But I mentioned going to cowboy movies as a child. That's what we did every Saturday, 15 cents to watch cowboy movies. But we had no television, of course, when I was a child. But the movies had always a news. You don't see this in movies anymore. They called it a newsreel, and it was like a newscast on television. And that's when we saw what was happening in the war that was over there in Europe and Japan, not in the United States. But that was the only awareness I had of what was actually happening until later I met people like Jan and others. I mentioned my German daughter-in-law. Her mother was my age, but she was a German child in a small village that was being bombed by the Americans. And so I came to know about war secondhand, not by any being a participant or a victim in any way.
Mm-hmm. I actually have a follow-up question to that one. Like you just said, you weren't really in the middle of it, but looking back now and remembering what was happening during those times, did you ever see something or understand something as a child that you're now registering to be part of the war that you didn't quite realize before?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, and I'll have to think about it. An odd thing happened. I lived in a small college town in Pennsylvania when I was a child. I lived with my grandparents because my father was away in the war. And about 30 miles from the town where I lived, there was a prison camp for German prisoners of war. They were brought to the United States and in this camp. And one time, a prisoner escaped. And he stole clothes. In those days, we didn't have dryers. Women hung the clothing on the clothesline outside. And my next door neighbor had left her laundry on the clothesline overnight. And this German prisoner came and stole clothes from the clothesline. So it was kind of a little bit of the war next door. Of course, it wasn't really, but it was a little glimpse into something that seemed so dramatic and exotic and exciting. At the same time, something that was true in every town in the United States, women would hang a symbol in the window My mother had one, and it had a star on it. It meant that somebody in our family was off in the war. It was my father. And if somebody had lost someone in the war, then the star was gold. It wasn't blue. And so you would see those symbols in people's windows, indicating that they had been affected directly, were being affected by the war.
So I have one last question for you, Lois, and then we're going to go to questions for both of you. So is this book purely from your point of view and your, like, you know, small memories or, you know, pictures as you described it before, or did you alter it at all to make it more of a, I guess, more of a story?
I didn't alter anything. I did a lot of research looking for young people who had been affected at Pearl Harbor on the Arizona and then in Hiroshima when the bomb fell, and looking for those whose stories were both ordinary so that you could understand them as another child, but also dramatic in some way. And I found something interesting, just kind of startling. There was one sailor on the Arizona who was up high on, I don't know what you call them, I'm not in the Navy, up there doing something way up high when the ship was bombed. And the ship split in half. And he slid down ropes to get down and to save himself, which he did. But he was wearing a watch. And he is long dead. He survived the bombing, but he died much later, and his children have his watch that he wore that day, and it stopped at 8:15, which was the time the Arizona was sunk. In Hiroshima, I found a story of a young teenage boy who that morning in August of 1945 was helping his father do repairs on the roof of his house. When the bomb hit, the house collapsed. He was badly injured, but he survived. And several months later, he left the hospital and made his way back to his house, where his house had been. The house, of course, was destroyed, looking for his father. He never found his father, who had been killed by the bomb, but he found his father's watch, and it had stopped at 8:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945. Isn't it ironic that those two events both happened at the same time in the morning? And both those watches, the one is in the museum in Hiroshima, you can see it there, and the other is in the hands of the children of the young man who had worn it.
Yeah, I remember reading that poem,
Yes.
or that little entry, and thinking, like, wow, that's quite a story. That's quite, yeah.
So this question is for both of you, so either of you can answer. Both of these books are they're both based on very heavy topics. How did you not get depressed or sad or, in that realm of emotions when writing, because it's such a heavy topic? Was there anything that you had to do? Did you have to, like, stop in the middle because it was so emotional, I guess?
Not for me. I have written the book very quickly, in 2 months or something like that, in the midst of other work I had, because the memories were still so lively. I remembered everything so clearly that it was easy to write it up and put it together in a story. But so no, it was still so close. That's yeah.
And as for me, it was not my story. It was the stories of other people, some of them tragic. And so often I was saddened by them. One in particular, a little story from Hiroshima, a little boy. His name is in the book. I've forgotten what it is, but he was 4 years old, riding his tricycle that morning. When the bomb hit, he was killed. His parents survived, and they buried him with his tricycle in their backyard. And then many years later, their parents now were old, they dug up that little grave and took out their child's bones and transferred them to a family cemetery. But the bicycle, I have seen the little tricycle. It's in the museum in Hiroshima. And it wasn't the writing of it that so saddened me. It was the standing in front of that little tricycle. And I think I wrote about this in the book, that's standing there.
Yeah.
Holding it up. Yes.
I read this little poem, and I cried. This is really sad.
The red tricycle. Yeah.
Shinichi
Tatsutani, yes.
Yeah.
Can you read it?
Chan, they called him. They buried him in the garden, and with him they buried his red tricycle. So it's often little details like that strike the reader or the writer, rather than a broad concept. It's a small thing that will attach itself to your brain and create those emotions. Actually, I watched Hamilton last night, which is the musical that everybody's
wonderful
watching.
Music. It's a wonderful, beautiful music, huh?
Yeah, I had seen it on in New York, and then to watch it on television recently was just as good. And there's a piece of history that seems so relevant today. Of course, everything seems relevant today. When you were talking about government and democratic government, I shouldn't go into politics, but these are strange times in this country.
You have a difficult time in the United States.
Oh, very difficult, yes.
Yeah.
Quinn is nodding his head.
Yeah. So I have a question for both of you. While you were doing research, it's very obvious that you both did a good amount of research. So when you were doing research on the topic, what events were most disturbing or surprising? What was most hard to read about and, think about it again when you're writing it down?
Well, evidently, Louis, you went to Denmark, you went to Hiroshima, and so forth. For me, that's not the case. I just wrote down what I had experienced. So I did no research for this book.
Your research was your own memory. Yes.
Yeah.
Quinn, one of the things, every little bit of information, personal information that I found was very moving. But the thing that comes to my mind is in the center section of the book about Hiroshima, was the Americans who dropped the bomb. My father, I didn't know as a child, nor did my mother know where my father was. She would write letters to him, but it was to a military address. We had no idea where he was, just that he was in the Pacific. It turns out that he was on the island of Tinian, which is where they loaded the bomb onto the plane to take it to bomb Japan. And so I did some research about the young men who were on that plane. There were 12 young men who flew 6 hours, dropped the bomb, and then flew 6 hours back. And this is in the book. I probably can't find it quickly enough, but I quoted it in the book. Stand by. Sorry. Anyway, I'm not finding it quickly, but when they flew back, they were silent, except for, okay, here it is. He named, this concludes, he named the airplane for his mom. It carried 12 men and a bomb. 6 hours back, no talk still, none, except, my God, what have we done? That was an actual quotation from the young man who was on that plane. So there were many such things. I've forgotten exactly what your question was, but were there particular instances that were very moving? And there were many for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jan, as Lois said, most of your research was all of your research was kind of just racking your brain for what you remembered. But I'm wondering if you remembered anything that you kind of forgot in the middle of the book and you were just like, oh, wow, I never remembered that. Or did you have anything like that?
I don't know. What is coming back very strongly these days is the fear for a government that was our enemy. Because people now ask me, can you compare the corona crisis with the war? I say, well, of course you can compare, but then you see enormous differences. And the main difference was that the government was our enemy. Now the government is our friend. You don't have to agree with everything they do, but they do it with the intention, at least, to save lives. And then, in those days, if, for instance, the resistance shot a German officer, they took 12 people, random people, notables. Often my father was a clergyman, so they could take him, and shot them. And that was a fear which I realized more and more the older I got, that this could happen to my parents, to my father especially. And that's coming back very strongly these days. 75 years ago, we had the liberation. And I remember one thing, I knew they were coming, the Canadians and the Americans, mainly Canadians at the time. And I saw them coming. And with my other eye, I saw my father leave the vicary. He was a man who was in a suit, and he never ran, and he couldn't swim, and he couldn't skate, and he had a sportive heart, but not a sportive body. And he came out of the vicary, and he danced. I'll never forget that. He danced so happy that we got again a democracy. That this danger of a government that is your enemy was over. And that is coming back very much these days, 75 years later.
And I think I remember ending the book Number the Stars, the one set in Denmark, with the end of the war, how the Danes stood on their balcony, the people in the book, and watched people dancing in the streets the day the war ended.
Yeah.
I have actually one more question that might be more specific to Jan, but Lois, you can also answer this. Both of you have had books that have been turned into movies, and I recently watched Winter in Wartime, the movie, and it was altered slightly. Obviously, movies aren't exactly as the books, but when you saw this movie that was based off of your book that you wrote, was there anything that surprised you or I guess made you or I don't know how to say this, but surprised you why they changed it? Or were any of the parts in the movie that they changed, was that your idea? Or
I spoke a lot with the director during the making of the film. And on one thing we disagreed. Michiel, the main person, shoots his uncle, Uncle Ben.
Yeah.
In the end, not in the book, but in the movie, and I disagreed with that. When I was writing it, I was thinking about it. Does he do that? 16-year-olds? No, I don't think so. But we disagreed, and he was the boss. It was his film. And
that's been my experience. They ask for your opinion, and you give your opinion, and then they ignore it.
They ignore it, and he even shot him in the back. If the anchor had attacked him, okay, but he shot him in the back. I think the movie is quite good, but that I really disagreed with.
That was one thing that when I was watching the movie, I was like, that doesn't seem like Michiel's character, because in the book, him and Uncle Ben, and also in the movie, they have a pretty strong relationship, and it seems like it would be so hard and difficult for a young guy like that to shoot someone who he closely loved. So that was also.
How were you able to watch the movie? Now, see, I want to see his movie, but I don't know where I can find it.
My family and I actually watched it last night on Amazon Prime, I think. It's also on Voodoo, so.
And is the title the same as the book title?
Yeah, it's called Winter.
So if I go to Amazon Prime, I might be able to watch it.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll do that.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your time.
Thank you.
Okay. You guys have been wonderful. Thank you for your questions. And Jan,
Yeah.
it was wonderful to meet you. I wish we could shake hands in person.
Yeah, Lois, if you come to the Netherlands, I don't travel much anymore, although they invited me to the United States for this book, but then Corona came in the way. But if you come to the Netherlands, you must come and see me, please. Huh?
Oh, I would love that. Yes.
With your healthy husband, I hope.
Yes.
And you young people, you have my full admiration for the way you've done this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much of an honor it is to be interviewing you two. It's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you both, Quinn and Tej.
Thank you so much.
You've been great.